Folks, we need to continue on talking about the SDS, and we are now in section 2 of the SDS document. And section number 2 focuses on what we would call hazard identification. Okay, so what's in this section, right? That's the purpose of these videos. We're going to talk about it in more detail, kind of really figure out what's there and what's not going to be found. Well, first, just like with section 1, section 2 is going to be up at the top of the SDS. So if I've got to look up this chemical or this compound and I am in a frantic because I want to know, is it going to be hazardous for me or not, then I don't want to read through pages and pages of stuff in order to figure that out. So in section 2 with hazard identification, what they're going to put into this section is something that we would call the potential health risk. Well, this makes sense, right? If it's hazard identification, they're going to identify the health risk that are associated with that compound. They're also going to put into focus the exposure. How do I expose myself to this chemical if it is poisonous? So can I inhale it? Can I put it on my skin? What should I do if that happens? Not only that, but we've talked about pictograms, right? Especially in the field of GHS. And the pictograms will also be listed in this section. So remember, one of those pictograms had like a dead fish by a river. Well, if this compound is an environmental hazard, those are the types of things that would be listed here underneath this section. It's a very quick view, and I don't have to read words about the good things and bad things, specifically bad, that this compound has with it. And then finally is our flammability and our reactivity. So is this stuff flammable? Will it explode? Will it blow up? Will it catch on fire? Will it react with other things to give me some of these nasty side products? Or would it react with other things to cause an explosion? Those are the types of tidbits that I can find in this section 2 of the SDS. Again, think of yourself as a firefighter or some type of emergency responder, and you go to the scene of a laboratory or in a chemical company, and they have told you that they have been exposed to a certain chemical. Well, by pulling up the SDS, and remember, it's really written for them, not for a laboratory person, all of these hazards kind of gravitate toward the top so they don't have to waste any more time to figure out what to do. Okay, the uses here, who would use this section 2? Well, physical hazards, broad health effects, but the problem is that it's not specific. So what we're going to say is that emergency responders would use this section quite a bit. That would be your firefighters and your EMT person, maybe your nurse when you get to the ER. You can use it with a laboratory manager or a laboratory worker, but they're really going to focus on hazard identification, and they're going to promote general statements here. It's not going to be anything specific. So if something did happen, they're not going to provide you details in this section. So the GHS also requires a number to be placed here as well. Remember, we said that numbers in the GHS system, typically the lower, the more hazardous. So if there is a health concern, they can slap a number 1 on it and tell you that this thing is drastically dangerous. So GHS does enforce a little bit here as far as acknowledgement goes when it concerns the hazards of the chemical. So as a laboratory worker, yes, this section is great for me. As a laboratory employer, yes, this section's great for me. The problem, though, is that it's very general. It's not specific. It really focuses on physical hazards, broad health effects, and for that reason, it's really utilized for emergency responders, nurses, and physicians that might need access to this information if something does happen. So that's going to be in section 2 for hazard identification, right? Okay, so we're going to move on and we're going to keep talking more details about these other sections. So our next section, of course, is section number 3, and now we're focused on what we would call composition and information. So what type of information would be found here? What could I maybe take to the bank? First is going to be the chemical purity. It's going to tell me how pure this stuff is. Very often, let's say that I'm working with aspirin in the laboratory, I can order aspirin in multiple different purities from a chemical manufacturer. It can be 99.9%, it can be 99% pure, it can be 98% pure, it can be 97% pure. Of course, the more pure it is, the more expensive it's going to be. But they're going to list purity here to give you an idea of, how strong, if you want to think of it that way, that this chemical might be that you're using. The other thing that's going to be listed in this section is the CAS number all over again. This is in case you missed it in the first section. It's going to repeat itself in section number 3. And it's also going to tell you if this chemical was a mixture or not. And if it's a mixture, it will ID all of the components that are supposed to be in this substance for you. Because maybe one component out of, 15 or 20 that make the mixture up, maybe that one is hazardous. And that's what's bringing all of these concerns to the table. The other 14, maybe they're very inert, maybe they're very safe. But that one component, if that's the way that this mixture's ended up being, really provides the SDS information and the requirement that chemical has to have. So what are the uses here for this section? The uses here would be just for general information. So again, laboratory workers and laboratory managers, it's great. I would say that also emergency responders would look at this as well to see what else they're working with in the mixture. But the reason that you would use this section is it will give you some idea on what we would call the cleanup and the disposal of the chemical itself. Okay, is any ingredient hazardous? If so, we've got to pay special attention to that. Can it go down the drain, or can we dump it in the garbage, or do we really have to send this thing off to a chemical waste industry for incineration and disposal? So that's what we would find in section number 3. So again, is it particular to a laboratory worker like maybe you in the future? The answer is no, not really. But we've already said most of the SDS is that way anyway, all right? But you should still be knowledgeable in it. So section number 4. Section 4 is the first aid measures. We're just going to keep trucking on here. So the first aid measures is what you would expect to find here, right? So it's general procedures on the first aid. Again, they're not going to give you anything specific. The lawyers and the chemical companies do not want that information in there. If you're a trained emergency responder or physician that has to provide first aid, then general statements should be good enough for you to understand what you need to do as far as treatment's concerned. But general procedures are what's going to be found here. This section is also mainly what we would call physician related. So as a laboratory worker, probably nothing in section 4 is going to pertain to me. Maybe I don't even know some of the terminology or basic lingo that's in this section, but it is physician related. So why would we use this section? Well, as a laboratory worker or as a laboratory manager, I would probably review section number 4, and this will give me an idea of the safety plan that I need to develop in a laboratory. So if something does happen, what should be the very first step for someone to take to make sure that this matter does not get worse? It will maybe also provide me a little bit of exposure limit as far as how much should you breathe in, how much should you get on your skin, and if you get over that limit, then what should we do in order for the first aid to kick in? So it really gives me a backdrop in a way to build my whole safety plan of action around this particular laboratory procedure, if that's the chemical that we're using in it. So that's what you're going to find in section 4, nothing more than that. Physician related, emergency responder related. You as a laboratory worker would probably never need to see that section, but if you're creating something of a method from scratch, this information will do you extremely well. Okay. The next one, section number 5. Section number 5 is basically the firefighting measures. Well, as you can probably tell, you would probably never need Section 5, but we at least want to say a few things about it, right? So this is going to provide some flammable properties. It's going to give me an idea of if this stuff catches on fire or is this stuff explosive, and it's going to give me some instructions here. But, you know, these instructions I'm not going to follow. I mean, if they're basic instructions like use a Class C fire extinguisher on it, then so be it, right? But as far as the instructions, they're going to be very general, but they're going to be very specific to firefighters, and that's what section number 5 is going to be. Why would I need to use this in a laboratory? Is there something that I can take away from it if I'm working in a lab or if I'm a lab manager and we're implementing this method that uses this particular type of chemical? Well, the answer is yeah, I can use this section for a purpose, and this is going to help me figure out what we would call a chemical hygiene plan. And we're going to talk about a chemical hygiene plan in the next set of lecture videos for the next part of the module. And we'll talk more detail about what this basically is and what should be included in the chemical hygiene plan. But as a lab worker, that's why maybe I would refer to section number 5 later on as we begin to develop the method from scratch. Okay? Section number 6, we're going to keep trucking on here. Section number 6 of the SDS, that's going to be what we call accidental release measures. So you're probably wondering, well, what does that actually mean, right? Well, it's just basically a fancy way of saying, what should you do if you spill it? Okay, if I'm in the laboratory and I'm using this liquid and I spill it all on the floor, what should I do in order to clean that up? If I'm using a solid and let's say that I accidentally turn the container of the solid over and it goes all over the countertop, what should I do in order to clean it up? So this section is relevant to us as a laboratory worker, but keep in mind that SDSs are written in view of industry, large chemical companies, right? It's not really concerning laboratory workers like yourself because we work with very small amounts. But there is a chance that I would maybe spill a 4-liter bottle or a kilogram of solid over on the countertop. So this is kind of the section that I would go to in order to figure out how to handle it and how to clean it up. So the uses, of course, that pretty much makes common sense. We're looking at a safety plan here. So if you do spill it, I can embed into the method kind of a clause or a statement that says, if any of this spills, then this is what you need to do in order to clean it up. I can go ahead and have the disposal thought of and the disposal plan written down on a sheet of paper. So that way, if that happens, those directions can be followed and we do not have to waste time to figure out what to do in order to clean it up. So it's going to develop a safety plan. It's going to also help me ID the material that's needed for cleanup. So if I want to do my job extremely well and I have a bunch of people maybe working with me or working for me, then I should basically tell them. I should not give them general statements like the SDS does. I should tell them what proper chemical or what proper spill kit in order to clean up these liquids and solids. So that way there's no question about it. They can automatically go right to the proper cleanup source, clean it up, and dispose of it the proper way. So again, as a lab manager, someone writing a method, someone overseeing a test, someone in charge of a protocol, maybe in my laboratory, then these are the things that I would want to think about and why I would use the SDS itself. Okay. Section number 7. Section number 7 is kind of a weird one. Section 7 is called handling and storage. All right, so the first thing that I want to say here, and I'm going to write this in a different color because I think it's important, this is not for laboratory use. Yes, it involves handling and storage, so I'm going to put H and S of the chemical. And you might think, well, that applies to a laboratory, right? I mean, I want to know how I should handle the containers when they're shipped to the lab, and I want to know how to store the containers when they're shipped to the lab. Well, the SDS is not going to provide this information to you. That's up to you to figure out how to do it. You need to take a look at other resources other than the SDS, and if you want to be responsible, you're going to have to figure out the proper way to store the chemical and to handle the chemical in your lab based on your lab's rules. Okay, there's the caveat there. Based on your lab's rules, whatever works for your company is how you should handle and store the chemical on site. So this handling and storage is the handling and storage of a chemical, but it's really for transportation here. So Department of Transportation, right? So if I'm a truck driver and I'm responsible in driving huge vats of acid from the state of California to the state of North Carolina for some reason, then how should I handle those vats of acid? What's the proper way to maybe ship them? What's the proper way to store them in the truckers? What's the proper way to transport them to get them to where they're going? That's basically what section number 7 is. So there's very general statements in this section, and those general statements really apply to the transportation aspect and the handling and storage of mass amount of chemical, not when it finally gets to the lab. When it finally gets to the laboratory, we are responsible to handle it and store it based on our laboratory rules, not based on basically this SDS section here. Okay, so the uses, it gives me an idea of what the hazards might be. So for instance, if it says that this stuff is flammable, then I would know as a laboratory worker, don't store this chemical near our flammable chemicals in a separate room, right? I would want to kind of keep this separate. I would want to keep this in a different general storage area and not mix it in with flammables if the thing is labeled as a flammable chemical. So we use some common sense when we read this section. Again, they're very general terms because there's no specific recommendations on handling the chemical in the lab. So you've got to think of large quantities here, right? Large quantities, metal drums, huge vats, things that you can't even pick up. That's what this is all about. So that's what section 7 is, not laboratory use, basically used for other purposes with other fields and other professions. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with section number 8, and we're going to keep doing this for every section of the SDS, so that way we get a better understanding of the type of material and its purpose in the actual document. So come back, don't quit on me yet. We're about halfway through the sections, and I'll try to go through the rest of them a little bit quicker, so that way it won't be tons and tons of minutes that you have to devote to me.